What could possibly cause a captain to reject a takeoff after rotation with a perfectly working aircraft, and what would happen if he did? As always, it's both complicated and fascinating, and as we will soon find out, not everything is what it seems. Stay tuned. In the morning of March the 12th, 2014, the 61-year-old captain in this story woke up in a great mood. On the previous day, he had sat through a meeting with his cardiologist, and the news he had received were really good. He had been quite worried because his medical had a limitation in it due to a bypass operation that he had gone through back in 2011, but now he was pretty sure that the doctors would allow him to extend his medical for at least another year. He loved his job and had managed to build up an astonishing 23,800 hours of total experience so far, and he had no intentions of stopping to fly early. He was operating the Airbus A320 for US Airways at the time, and he had flown a total of 4,500 hours on the type, making him quite experienced and comfortable with it. The 12th of March was going to be his last off day before his work schedule would resume, so he spent it relaxing and then he went to bed early in order to prepare for a red-eye departure on the following day. Then, on the accident day, the 13th of March 2014, he woke up at 04:45 and felt rested and fine. He got into his uniform and drove to his home airport in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and then caught a jump seat ride over to Charlotte in North Carolina, where his duty was going to begin. His flight ended up landing on time, and he had managed to get a 90-minute nap on it, so when he signed in for his duty at around 09:30, he felt rested and generally in a great shape. And this was also when he first met the first officer that he was going to share his duty with. She was 62 years old and actually lived in the Charlotte area, which meant that she had been able to sleep until 0800 on the 13th, and she had also been off for the previous 3 days, which meant that she felt great as she signed in for the duty. Now, the first officer was also very experienced, with a total of 13,000 hours under her belt, and that included 4,700 hours on the Airbus A320, which they were now going to operate. Now, the reason I'm explaining all of this is to show you that this was a well-rested and highly experienced crew, who also both had perfectly normal training records and no indications of any type of problems. A perfectly ordinary, normal crew, in other words, which shows that what is about to happen to them could theoretically happen to anyone. In any case, after the two pilots had greeted each other and their 3 cabin crew colleagues, they started going through the pre-flight paperwork for their coming 3 flights. The plan was that they were going to start with a flight from Charlotte over to Tampa, and then from there onwards towards Philadelphia, and finally over to Fort Lauderdale in Florida, which, if you remember, was the captain's home airport. There was absolutely nothing special in the weather and NOTAMs that would indicate any issues, except maybe some strong gusty winds in the Philadelphia area later on. But apart from that, the flight plans were all straightforward, so they soon finished up their briefing and then started walking out towards the gate. Now, we don't really know who was pilot flying and pilot monitoring on the first 2 flights, but we do know that the aircraft departed normally from Charlotte and that the 2 first flights were operated without any significant issues. This meant that the crew arrived on time to Philadelphia at around 16:49, and when they did, they were advised that they needed to do an aircraft change before their final flight over to Fort Lauderdale. Now, aircraft changes is a bit of a nuisance for air crews because they generally mean that the first aircraft needs to be completely shut down and have the catering bars closed and sealed, and then the new aircraft needs to be prepared again with a full setup instead of the shorter turnaround setup that normally would have been used otherwise. And this generally takes a bit longer time to do, at least on the Boeing 737 that I operate. And on top of that, the crew obviously also needs to physically move location from wherever their old aircraft was to the new. So with the next departure time scheduled for 17:50, the crew now had almost exactly 1 hour to get this done, which is a bit on the tight side, but normally should be okay. Like I mentioned before, the weather was quite windy in Philadelphia, and the pilots had therefore decided that the captain was going to be pilot flying. So, whilst he stopped in the gate to talk to the dispatcher, the first officer proceeded into the cockpit and started setting up the flight management computer, according to US Airways standard operating procedures. This new aircraft was a shiny 15-year-old Airbus A320 with no relevant technical issues recorded on it. But it is worth talking a little bit about a few of the systems on board this aircraft before we continue. First, let's talk about something known as the flex temperature takeoff thrust setting. Almost every commercial aircraft that operate today have engines fitted that can produce much more takeoff thrust than is actually needed, at least for most of the runways and conditions that they operate in. Now, this is of course in order to give the airlines the possibility to also operate at hot and high airports or in places with high obstacles around where more thrust would be needed. But using this extra thrust also means that the engines are subjected to more wear and tear, on top of also using more fuel and creating more noise than needed. So in order to counteract this, the engine makers have created different ways to derate the engines, basically telling them to use only as much thrust as is really needed in order to conduct the takeoffs safely. In the case of the Airbus A320, this is done by the pilot calculating a flex temperature, which is inserted into the flight management computer during the takeoff performance calculation. That temperature basically tricks the engine into thinking that the outside temperature is higher than normal and to therefore produce less thrust. On the Boeing 737 that I fly, we have a similar system known as assumed temperature. And if you're interested in seeing exactly how we'll calculate that, as well as how to fly your home simulator professionally, well then check out Ben's and my course using this QR code or the link here in the description. In any case, it is really important to understand that this flex temperature needs to be reconfirmed every time that there is a takeoff related change entered into the FMC, like a new intersection takeoff or a change in runway. That's because any such changes must also come with a change in performance and therefore a possible need for a completely different thrust setting. And that, by the way, also goes for the takeoff speeds, the V1, rotation and V2 speeds, who might also need to change. Remember that. Once the performance calculation has been made, which in the case of US Airways apparently comes in the form of a document sent over from dispatch, the pilots will enter and confirm this. And in order for the engines to actually then use this flex thrust, the thrust levers needs to be placed in the flex MCT detent during takeoff. So what does that mean then? Well, on the Airbus, the thrust levers have 5 different detents. If we start in idle, the thrust levers can then be moved backwards, first into idle reverse thrust and then further back into the last detent where they will command full reverse thrust. But if the thrust levers are instead moved forward, they will first go into the CL, which stands for climb thrust, and then to the flex MCT, which stands for flex takeoff thrust and max continuous thrust, and then finally fully forward into toga, which will give either max takeoff thrust or go-around thrust depending on the flight segment. So for a flex takeoff to be made, basically 2 different things needs to be fulfilled. A valid flex temperature higher than the outside temperature needs to have been entered into the FMC, and the thrust levers needs to be placed in the flex MCT detent. Now the next system that we have to discuss is the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System, or ECAM. This system includes a computer network that processes and displays engine and system parameters and corrective procedures in case of any malfunction. And the primary components of the systems are 2 system data acquisition concentrators and 2 flight warning computers. The ECAM will show the pilots different warnings and actions on their screens, and the importance of those warnings are then categorized into different colors. Red requires immediate action. Amber requires awareness but no immediate action, and green just gives information but normal operation can still continue. Now, in case of an amber alert, this is then sub-categorized into 2 different levels, where level 1 just causes an amber alert to pop up on the screens, but the level 2 alert also activates an amber master caution warning and a single oral chime. And that warning will soon come to play a big role here. Now, you have probably also heard how the Airbus have a very rude retard oral alert, which can be announced during the landing flare.
Retard, 10.
But as it turns out, this alert can also be activated for a very obscured secondary reason, which will soon become important. And when we're on the subject of obscure things, Did you know that your personal information is likely right now being bought and sold without your knowledge or consent? Well, there are sites out there like this one, where you can literally buy access to someone's phone number, email, home address, and even social media profiles. And that could very well be your profiles being sold. All this is, crazily enough, completely legal, and that's why I am so happy to have today's sponsor, Incogni, on my side. You see, once your data ends up with these data brokers, trying to get it removed is a real pain. You will have to literally contact every one of them individually, and there are hundreds of them out there, so most people won't even know where to start. But Incogni will handle all of this for you, finding and reaching out to all of these brokers on your behalf and then demand that your personal data is removed. And they don't just do this once. They will continue to scan for your data and keep removing it to keep your privacy protected. When I first signed up, I was literally shocked over just how many sites were selling my data. There were well over 100 of them. And the result, after having used Incogni for over a year, is way less spam and annoying robocalls. So if you are ready to take back control over your own personal data, you can use this QR code or go to incogni.com/pilot with the code PILOT to get a fantastic 60% discount from their annual plan. That's incogni.com/pilot. Thank you, Incogni. Now let's continue. Okay, so normally the retard alert is generated as a reminder to the crew to make sure that the thrust is reduced back to idle during the flare.
Retard.
If the auto throttle is engaged, this alert happens at 10 feet radio, and if the aircraft is flying with manual thrust, it happens already at 20 feet. But it is only activated if the following criteria are all met. The aircraft speed is above 80 knots and the radio altitudes are at or below the levels that I just mentioned, 10 or 20 feet. Both thrust levels are not set to idle and TOGA, or a correct flex temperature, is not engaged. But according to a bulletin created by Airbus back in 2008, this callout could also be generated if the aircraft is accelerating above 80 knots during a takeoff, if the flight warning computer can't establish what flight phase it is in, for example due to an incorrect thrust setting. In that case, it might default into thinking that the aircraft is in the landing phase instead of a takeoff, and since all of the above criteria will then be met, it will also activate the alert. Now, the guidance from Airbus, if this were to happen, was to then immediately move the thrust levels into the TOGA detent, which would both silence the alert and also make sure that the aircraft has maximum takeoff thrust set for the takeoff. Now, I know that that was quite a lot of information to keep track of, but it will all make sense soon, I promise. So, back to our story. The captain was still outside when the first officer started inputting all of the performance data into the flight management computer. She also entered the route that they had received via their flight plan, but for some reason she entered runway 27 right as the departure runway instead of runway 27 left, which the flight plan had said. Now, this is a pretty easy mistake to make, since the select buttons are normally right next to each other on the FMC CDU. And in any case, this should have been picked up during the later ATC route clearance verification procedure, which both pilots had to do together. But for some reason, this was then also missed when that procedure was completed. Now, it is possible that some complacency was involved here, we don't really know. These route checks are obviously just as important as all other checks that we do, but sometimes, especially if there is a perceived time pressure, they can end up being rushed. Anyway, the rest of the setup was completed just as normal, and by time 1702, so just 2 minutes behind schedule, US Airways Flight 1702 was finally pushed back from its stand with a total of 154 people on board. Now, the weather that the pilots had received from their ATIS indicated clear skies with great visibility, a temperature of 0 degrees Celsius and winds coming from 290 degrees at 18 knots, gusting up to 28, so quite windy but mostly down the runway. But the ATIS also indicated runway 27 left as its departure runway, so that would have provided the crew with yet another chance to verify that the correct runway had been selected. But that didn't happen. Just before the aircraft pushed back, the crew were advised to expect an earliest departure clearance time of 18:29, which would mean a slight delay, so the captain decided to initially only start up one of the engines and taxi out single engine. Now, I know that this is standard practice in many airlines since it saves both fuel and emissions, but we don't do that in my airline since it also increases complexity and pushes workload forward closer to the runway. In any case, when the pushback was completed at around time 17:54, the company sent Flight 702 their final weight and balance information and the first officer entered it into the computer. But it is a little bit unclear if she used the uplink function to do this or if she entered the V-speeds and flex temperature manually through the CDU. In any case, the departure runway was not changed at this point. Instead, at time 18:08, the crew contacted the ground controller and was given taxi clearance towards runway 27 left for departure. The taxi out was then completed uneventfully, and the aircraft soon found itself at the back of the departure queue as number 6 for departure. And as they were waiting, the captain started up the second engine and then conducted a flight control check. At time 18:21 and 22 seconds, the crew were switched over to the tower controller where they were advised that they would now be next in line for departure. The crew read this back and the first officer then started to challenge the last part of the taxi checklist, but as she was doing that, she was suddenly interrupted by a call from the cabin where a cabin crew advised that there was a passenger in the toilet. This was resolved a short moment later when the passenger walked back to his seat, but this is actually a great example of the kind of distractions that can often happen to us pilots, and any distractions always increases the risk of mistakes being made. That is actually one of the reasons why strict adherence to checklists and procedures is so critically important. If we pilots ever find ourselves, for example, rhyming a checklist, meaning reading without thinking, this needs to be promptly acknowledged and then the involved checklist needs to be restarted from the beginning again. I'm saying this because the part of the checklist that the first officer was dealing with when this interruption happened here included to check for the correct takeoff speeds and settings, and that particular checklist point must be done with the correct runway inserted. Now, the pilots would have been able to spot this both on the FMC CDU and on the navigational display if it had been referenced in the checklist flow, but it wasn't. In any case, during the time that the first officer was dealing with the passenger in the back, the crew now also received their clearance to line up and wait on runway 27 left. And as the captain read this back and started moving forward, he suddenly did notice that they had the wrong runway in the FMC, probably by doing his own kind of cross-check. Now, like I said earlier, this can definitely happen. And even though there are several steps included in the procedures to cross-check this, if an error still has been left this far, there are plenty of ways to still fix it. The correct thing to do would have been to call ATC back and advise them that they couldn't accept the lineup clearance and instead would have to hold at the holding point for a few more minutes. Now, that would have not made the controller very happy, but changing the runway comes with a lot of potential threats. So it's absolutely not the time to rush. But in this case, the captain just continued to slowly taxi into position while simultaneously telling the first officer to quickly change the runway over from 27 right to 27 left. This happened at approximately time 18:22 and 40 seconds, and the first officer quickly did what she was told and completed the task in less than 30 seconds. But as I'm sure that you've all guessed by now, that speed also came with a price. You see, when you change the runway, all the performance data automatically falls out of the computer since, like I mentioned before, every runway needs a different performance calculation. Even if the runways are parallel, like in this case, they could still differ in length, slope and obstacles in the departure direction, so when the change is executed, the FMC will just leave the V-speeds and flex temperature box prompts empty, whilst suggesting the previous figures in blue prompts next to the empty boxes. This is then combined with an amber scratchpad message saying check takeoff data as a reminder to do this step, and until the speeds are reselected, a red speed select message will also appear on the pilot's primary flight displays. But in her rush to switch the runways, the first officer completely missed this, and those performance fields were therefore just left blank. Now you might think that this mistake should be quite easy to spot, but the problem with rushing is that details like this can easily actually be missed. And since the aircraft was now entering an active runway, the captain would have been busy maneuvering the aircraft and making sure that both the runway and the approach path was clear of other traffic, so it was unlikely that he was going to be able to catch this. Unless, of course, that part of the checklist would have been repeated, which it was not. So what all of this meant was that the aircraft was soon lined up and ready for departure, but with no V-speeds or flex temperature selected. Now before we go any further here, I just want to mention a very important crew resource management point here. If you are a first officer watching this, I want you to remember this as an excellent example of where you absolutely need to speak up. You see, we captains can sometimes be a bit too go-minded and focus on getting the show on the road, but changing the runway in the FMC is a crucial procedure to get properly done and right, and it's therefore always better to take a few minutes to do that, which might require you to tell the captain to please wait for a few minutes. I'm saying this because during our crew resource management courses, we're often faced with scenarios where the first officer needs to speak up about big, safety critical things like when a captain is breaking procedures or where a critical error has been committed. But in reality, it is in everyday scenarios like this that you will most likely have to put your foot down, and that doesn't just go for aviation, it is the same in almost all jobs out there. Anyway, about 15 seconds after the first officer had finished changing the runway, the tower controller told flight 1702 to maintain heading 230 degrees after departure and then clear them for takeoff. The first officer read this back, and at time 18:23 and 34 seconds, the captain moved the thrust levers first into climb and then 9 seconds later into the flex detent. And at the same time, his side stick was also moved forward in the nose down direction in order to get more pressure on the nose wheel to help the steering. The aircraft was already accelerating when the thrust levers were moved into the flex detent, and as soon as that happened, a one-time chime could be heard in the cockpit. This was then also accompanied by an ECAM message saying engine thrust levers not set, with instruction in white to move the thrust levers into the toga detent. The first officer immediately called out, "Engine thrust levers not set." But instead of pushing the thrust levers fully forward as the procedure described, the captain now moved them backwards into the climb detent and then pushed them back into the flex detent again, while also calling out, "They're set." Now what had obviously happened here was that since no flex temperature had been re-entered after the runway change, the computer didn't know what thrusts the pilots wanted from the flex detent and therefore generated this warning. The Airbus systems are generally very well engineered, so even if a pilot didn't follow the guidance to push the thrust levers into toga, the thrust would still go up to max after approximately 8 seconds in this case. But since the thrust levers still would then sit in the flex detent, another system would also soon get involved. Here it's also worth mentioning again the difference between the high and low speed regimes during takeoff. Now, I have explained this in several of my previous videos, but the short version is that as an aircraft starts building up speed during the takeoff, it both uses up more and more runway, leaving less and less distance left to brake, and its total kinetic energy keeps increasing, meaning that it will need more distance to stop. Now obviously all of this has been calculated to still allow for a rejected takeoff all the way up to V1, the decision speed, but the pilot actions become more and more critical the closer to V1 that the aircraft accelerates, and because of this we pilots typically refer to the low speed regime up to 18 knots as the time where we can easily reject the takeoff, and therefore will do so for basically anything. That includes master caution warnings, burst tires, strange noises, as well as obviously more serious things like engine failures, fires, predictive wind shear warnings, and if the aircraft is unsafe or unable to fly. But above 80 knots, well then it's a little bit of a different story. That's what we refer to as the high speed regime, and there we are more go-minded and will typically only reject for critical failures like engine failures, fires, predictive wind shear warnings, or if the aircraft is unable or unsafe to fly. All other minor issues is considered safer to take into the air, sort out after takeoff, and then potentially return for a landing with the whole runway available to stop on. In this case, since the speed was still below 80 knots when the warning activated, the crew could have easily decided to reject the takeoff and take a closer look at what had caused it. But that's not what this captain decided to do. Instead, he felt that the aircraft was accelerating normally, and maybe he thought that he had pushed the thrust levers fully forward. It's hard to know. But in any case, the first officer must have been a bit preoccupied here, because she now missed her 80 knots call-out, which serves as both an airspeed cross-check and also a clear divider between the low and the high-speed takeoff regime. And then, as the aircraft passed 86 knots, an oral
Retard
alert suddenly also activated in the cockpit. Now, that warning was basically only associated with landings for these two pilots, so it likely caused quite a bit of confusion here. And the captain called out, "What did you do? You didn't load, we lost everything," as he had now likely been prompted to start scanning his instruments and had therefore realized that they didn't have any V-speeds either. But at this point, they were now well above 100 knots, and the captain therefore didn't want to reject the takeoff in the high-speed regime, and he also remembered the V-speeds from their earlier briefs. So instead of stopping, they now just continued to accelerate, with the retard alert still blaring on in the background. Now, if you remember, the reason this warning had been activated was because of the computer confusing the takeoff roll with the landing due to the missing flex temperature. So if the pilots would have just pushed the thrust lever into the toga detent, this warning would have disappeared. But again, that didn't happen. Now, the first officer at this stage assumed that the captain wouldn't try to take off without any valid V-speeds, but she didn't actually call this out. And since she didn't, as the aircraft accelerated past 143 knots, the captain suddenly just said, "Well, we'll get that straight when we're airborne," and then continued the takeoff. At time 18:24 and 9 seconds, the first officer called out, "I'm sorry," but that didn't help very much here, since the aircraft had already reached 152 knots, which was very close to the previously calculated V1 decision speed of 157. You see, we captains are trained to remove our hands from the thrust levers when we hear V1. We do that because we know that a rejection after that speed will likely lead to the aircraft overshooting the runway and potentially breaking up. So after V1, we will instead focus on just getting the aircraft safely into the air, basically no matter what. The only reason we would ever reject after V1 would be if the aircraft is clearly unable to fly for some catastrophic reason, like a dual engine failure or a structural failure of the aircraft. But it is worth remembering here that no one ever practices rejected takeoffs after V1, since that's possibly one of the last things that we want pilots to get used to. In this case though, the acceleration just continued, but without any of the associated callouts from the first officer. As the aircraft accelerated past 164 knots, the captain started pulling back on his side stick to initiate rotation of the aircraft, and it slowly then started to get airborne. But somewhere around here, something must have happened inside the mind of the captain. Maybe it was the blaring retard alert, the absence of callouts from his first officer, a sudden gust of wind shaking the aircraft, or it was the combination of all of these factors. But whatever it was, he clearly now started doubting his decision to continue the takeoff in the first place. But of course the aircraft was now just about to get airborne, using up loads of runway below it, and on top of that, it was working perfectly, so surely there was no way to reverse that decision now, right? Well, as it turns out, yes there was, but not a good one. Whatever the reason, the captain had now suddenly gotten the impression that his aircraft was unsafe to fly, and therefore, as the aircraft accelerated past 167 knots, he suddenly retarded the thrust levers to idle and pushed his side stick forward. And the result of this was immediate and devastating. The combined effect of his forward input on the side stick and the under-mounted engine suddenly reducing the thrust back to idle was that the aircraft immediately and quickly started pitching forward. Now the captain obviously felt the speed of this movement and therefore soon reversed his inputs, but it was then too late. At time 18:24 and 14 seconds, the nose gear slammed into the runway, recording a load of 3.7 G as it did. And since the captain was now still pulling back on his side stick when that happened, the combination of that, their speed and the violent impact of the nose gear now sent the aircraft bouncing back into the air, with the radio altimeter soon indicating a maximum height of 15 feet. Surveillance cameras in the area actually captured the aircraft at this point, fully airborne, but it wasn't going to stay that way for very long. With the thrust still at idle, and the captain realizing that they were now flying even though he had decided to reject, he again pushed his side stick forward in order to try and reduce the bounce and to get the aircraft back down onto ground. And he then pulled back slightly in order to soften the touchdown. But at this point, the aircraft had lost a lot of its speed, so when it now started descending back towards the runway with the side stick asking for a pitch up, it ended up touching down with the tail first, then the main landing gear, and finally, with a force much higher than it was designed for, the nose gear slammed into the ground and completely collapsed. You see, the nose gear is the most delicate part of the landing gear structure and must be handled with delicacy and care. But that was absolutely not what happened here. The result of this was that the aircraft now ended up careening down the runway with the nose scraping against the asphalt, dragging up a huge cloud of smoke behind it. The lack of nose gear steering would have left the pilots with very limited steering ability, but luckily they were still able to apply their brakes, which meant that at around time 18, 24 and 48 seconds, the now severely damaged aircraft finally came to a stop on the left side of runway 27 left. An evacuation was immediately initiated, and the cabin crew were able to deploy almost all of the slides except on door to right, where smoke was observed outside, and to left, since the nose-down attitude of the aircraft now didn't allow for that slide to actually reach the ground. Eventually, all 154 passengers and crew were able to evacuate safely, with only 2 minor injuries reported, and those both happened during the actual evacuation. So that was all fine, but the aircraft was so badly damaged that it was eventually written off, and it is, as far as I know, still sitting on the apron at Philadelphia Airport to this day. Let me know in the comments if you've actually seen it, and don't forget to subscribe when you're down there leaving a comment. It really helps the channel. The investigation started immediately, and in this case, the investigators had the good fortune of being able to interview both the pilots, crew and passengers directly, which greatly helped. After they had gone through all of the available data, including the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, the NTSB found that the probable cause of the accident was the captain's decision to reject the takeoff after the aircraft had already rotated and above V1. Contributing to the accident was the flight crew's failure to follow standard operating procedures by not verifying that the FMC was properly set up after the runway had been changed in the FMC. Now, the fact that the Airbus could call out retard also during the takeoff roll came as a big surprise to a lot of pilots in the industry. And although the procedure had always been to move the thrust levels into the toga detent if the engine thrust levels not set warning was enunciated, Airbus, after this accident, updated their guidance to also say that if the retard call-out was heard during the takeoff roll, even above 80 knots, the takeoff should just be rejected. Which sounds like a quite reasonable thing to me. If the aircraft calls for retard, just do it. On a separate note, I want to use this accident to highlight a few things to you, young new pilots out there. Whenever you think that something should be done or doesn't look right, make sure that you say it. I know that that's very hard to do during the takeoff roll especially, but a simple "should we stop?" could be enough to get the captain out of a faulty decision-making loop. Now, the captain will still be the one taking the decision, but at least you have made your voice heard, and if the decision still is to continue, well then the standard operating procedures have to be completed, because the further away from the normal procedures that you get, the more mistakes will be made. Now, this was a slightly shorter video, and I would really like to hear what you guys thought about it. I absolutely love it when you guys send us suggestions as well, especially about what accidents and incidents that you want us to cover, so please keep doing that. And if you want to see my next video before everyone else, and also have a chance to come with feedback on it, well then join my Patreon crew by scanning this QR code here or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. I'm actually gearing up for a Patreon hangout tomorrow, which I'm really looking forward to. It's always great to answer all of their questions in person, and it's normally just like having a cup of coffee with a group of great friends. Now, watch this video next, it's super interesting. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you are watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.